In other podcasts, you describe this whole argument as a three-legged
Yeah.
stool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go through that. So, what are the three legs of this sort of whole scenario?
Well, the three that we typically see being used are animal welfare, human health, environmental health. And people have historically argued from one or another of those kind of angles for plant-based eating. Then some bright spark connected all three of them, and now everybody connects all three of them. The advocates of plant-based eating typically connect all three. And they say, not only is plant-based eating good for the environment, but it's better for the animals and better for human health. So bingo, how could you possibly refuse such a strong argument? Because three-legged stools, as we know, are very strong. If you remove any one of those legs, if you start to question whether or not a plant-based diet is better for health, for instance, those who are arguing based on that three-legged stool set of arguments get very angry, because they like the neatness of the package, the thing that says from every angle, whatever way you look at it, this is best. And so what I tried to do in the book was to unpick the arguments on all of those angles, particularly environment and human health. And I did address animal welfare to a certain extent, because I wanted individuals to be able to see that it is not such a neat, strong stool. It's a pretty wobbly stool, actually.
I like that you've cited, actually, I think it's from The Vegetarian Meat by Lear Keith.
Yes.
And you've cited one of her quotes where she says that, it's so much easier to come up with a slogan of meat is murder, and everyone relates to it. However, if you come up with with another slogan, for example, monocrops are murder, it's suddenly less relatable. Which is equally actually correct.
It is.
But no one relates to that. So
that's right. And in fact, I have done that. I've tried that in certain situations. I think we all try out different arguments in different scenarios. And I've tried saying things like monocrops are murder, and people look at me dumbfounded. What do you mean? And of course they are murder from the point of view of murdering the soil, murdering the organisms in the soil. But they're also murder in the sense that animals get killed in the course of monocrop farming, as you know. But when you tell that to somebody for the first time, they are flabbergasted. They maybe don't believe you. They certainly take some time to come around to that point of view.
Another thing that you mentioned, which actually makes sense, what's actually solidified over the past maybe 30 to 40 years, solidified the plant-based diet argument for to save the planet, to save the human race, because it's the best diet for humans. What's actually hyped it up is the media itself.
Yeah.
Right? And you talk about that, I think, right in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, the media has played a big role. And in fact, I devoted an entire chapter to talking about the various ways that media misrepresents the whole landscape in this debate. And that misrepresentation ranges from the very small, kind of seemingly innocuous levels of misrepresentation to bold-faced, very nearly lies and negligence on their part. So, an example of the former would be, for instance, that, some studies, a study, for instance, that I talk about, showed that people who eat a variety of very nutrient-dense food, ranging from livers and kidneys and eggs through to greens, live longer. Now, setting aside whether that study was any good or not, setting aside whether they actually do live longer, and we can talk about that at a later stage, what the papers picked up on was eat your greens and live longer. And it's kind of a lazy reporting, which is I'm just going to go with the zeitgeist. I'm going to pick the thing out which everybody really wants to hear and which I am used to hearing as a journalist. I'm just going to say that. And so that's done every day, 10 times over in every newspaper, So that's really that low level, consistent misrepresentation that we get all the time.
So, let's look at least one of the angles. Let's start with the environmental angle, right?
Yeah.
So this whole argument of climate change, and the cows are to blame. Take us to that. So is it the cows that are producing, because the cow producing the most greenhouse gases? Are the cows actually the gorilla in the room? What's the gorilla in the room?
Well, the gorilla in the room, as Frank Mitloehner, who's a researcher in this field, likes to say, is definitely fossil fuels and fossil fuel use. And that accounts for over 80% of all emissions. So we must always focus on that. So anything that's using fossil fuels is going to be generating excessive emissions. And to the extent that farming, including livestock farming, is also buffeting up that fossil fuel system, to that extent, yes, it is contributing. And so the kind of farming which is very bad for climate change is farming that, for instance, uses fossil fuel-based nitrogen fertilizers, for instance. Plant farming does that. So does some animal farming to grow the grains that feed some animals. So to that extent, yes, of course, livestock farming is a contributor, but how much of a contributor? And is that being overblown? And of course, I'm arguing that it is being overblown for various reasons. And I go through all the different ways that the impact of livestock is exaggerated. One of them is this very simple fact that livestock's emissions, which are widely agreed to be around 14% of the total emissions in the world, although the FAO did come out with a lower number this year and said 11%. But that number is based on a real life cycle analysis for livestock. So you're taking everything into account: what the cow eats, how it's raised, how it's transported, how that food gets to the table, okay? Transport, by contrast, does not take any life cycle stuff into account. So it's basically just looking at the emissions from the tailpipe. We're not looking at construction of the cars, the roadway system, the construction of the roads, and then the reconstruction of the roads, and all of the rainforests that, for instance, and forests that is taken down when we drive a new road through any country. So it's a really unfair comparison. And what the FAO said was, if you did a fair comparison and you took the life cycle element out of the cows, you'd have cows being responsible for about 5% and transport 14%. So suddenly that whole thing is flipped, right? So that's just a really simple way that the picture is distorted. But one of the other ways is just this whole misunderstanding around methane. Methane is an incredibly complex thing. The methane issue is a complex issue. But all we ever hear is that cows generate methane through their burps, although a lot of people say back-end activity. It's really burps. And therefore, we have to stop it. What they're not accounting for in that methane argument is the fundamentally different nature of the methane that is coming from cows. It is part of what's known as the biogenic cycle, meaning that it comes out of the cows. It is broken down by something called hydroxyradicals in the air, and it comes back to Earth as in form of carbon, which is absorbed through photosynthesis into the ground, into the plants that the cows eat. And the active role that cows play in this is that they can increase the extent to which that carbon is sequestered by creating different conditions in the ground if they're raised correctly. So we never take into account that sequestration. We never take into account not just what's going up, but what's being sucked back, the sinks. People call it sinks. So unless you're looking at the whole cycle, and if you're just looking at what's coming out, you're really not getting a very a very rounded picture. So it's complicated. It's complicated. And I think as you will have noticed at the panel that I ran at the session where you and I met, all three of my panelists, or certainly a couple of them, do believe that there is potential to cool the earth and to leverage the power of cattle to do that by reducing herd size just a little bit, because you set in place a motion which creates that, for want of a more complex description, it makes that virtuous circle work better to cool the earth.